My name is Linda, I'm 68 years old, and the day I discovered my daughter-in-law had used my old credit card to spend over $53,000 on jewelry and a luxurious trip was the day I stopped being the quiet, polite woman everyone thought they could walk all over, because that was also the day I realized I had something she didn't see coming. It all started on a Monday morning that felt as ordinary as any other. I had just poured my usual cup of coffee and settled into the same old kitchen chair I sat in every morning, the one across from the window that faced the maple tree Bill planted the year we moved in. Outside, everything looked calm. The lawn still damp from last night's rain, a bird hopping near the garden hose, nothing that hinted at how quickly everything was about to shift. I had just finished feeding the neighbor's cat, who always cried at my door around 7, and reached for my phone to scroll through the headlines when I noticed a notification from the bank. I didn't think much of it at first. I rarely buy anything big, so those alerts usually don't mean much. But this one caught my eye. The amount was staggering, more than $53,000, and the purchases were listed from high-end stores and a luxury hotel in Miami. At first, I froze, thinking it must have been some mistake. Maybe a scam. But as I looked closer, I realized the charges had been made with a credit card I hadn't used in nearly 15 years. It was an old account, one Bill and I had opened together before he passed. I had kept it active only because it was linked to a few things I never got around to switching. But I hadn't touched it in ages. The card itself was tucked away in a drawer I never opened unless I needed to dig out old tax documents or Bill's insurance files. No one should have known it even existed. That's when a memory started to push its way through. One of those moments you don't realize is important until it comes back sharp and clear when you need it most. A few days earlier, Vanessa had come by the house saying she wanted to look at some old cookbooks I'd mentioned. Greg had dropped her off saying he'd be back shortly, and she had wandered around the place like a woman casing a store. She opened drawers with too much interest, complimented things she used to roll her eyes at, and even commented on how nostalgic the house felt, as if it were already hers to inherit. At one point, I'd stepped out of the kitchen to switch a load of laundry, and when I returned, she was standing beside the table, holding my purse, explaining she'd just been looking for a pen. I'd smiled politely and let it go, but something in the way she'd handled my things had stayed with me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Vanessa had never really tried to be part of this family. From the day she married Greg, it felt more like she was playing a role than living a life. She called me Mom when others were listening, but her eyes always said something colder. She never asked about my health, never offered to help with anything, but she always found a reason to drop by whenever she needed something. Whether it was a dish for some potluck she didn't want to cook for, or help with the down payment on a new car she claimed was an investment for their future. Greg, my only son, saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. I don't blame him. I raised him to believe in kindness and trust. But maybe I didn't teach him how to recognize when those things are being used against you. After seeing the charges and recognizing the pattern, I called the bank. I didn't sound angry or panicked, just calm and firm, like I used to be in my working days at the credit union. I asked them to send me a full breakdown, dates, times, locations, and any digital trails they could collect. They offered to cancel the card and start a fraud investigation, but I told them not to. Not yet, because something had shifted in me. I didn't want to just clean up the mess. I wanted to understand the full shape of the betrayal. I wanted to see how far she'd go. I needed her to think she'd gotten away with it, just long enough for me to take control on my own terms. Later that same day, as the light outside started to soften into that golden haze that comes just before dusk, another message came through. This one wasn't from the bank. It was from an unfamiliar number. The photo showed Vanessa wrapped in a luxury hotel robe, champagne glass in hand, with a wide smile and a diamond necklace that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. She'd included a short note, casually thanking me for the gifts, the tone of it drenched in smugness, as if she truly believed I'd funded her little vacation with love and approval. I didn't flinch. I didn't call Greg. I didn't cry. Instead, something inside me went still, not with fear, but with clarity. Because what Vanessa didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly realized, was that the card she'd used wasn't just any old account. Years ago, after a string of scams in our area, Bill had quietly enrolled that credit line in a monitoring program designed to flag unusual activity among seniors, particularly in cases of family exploitation. I'd forgotten all about it, until now. That account had been dormant for so long, but it was still tied to a system that automatically alerted financial protection services when certain patterns were detected. She thought she'd stolen from someone too old to notice. What she didn't see was that the very thing she used to take from me had just opened the door for me to take everything back, and I was going to do it with a calm voice, a steady hand, and a smile she'd never forget. By the time the sky turned black that evening, I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to play the role she cast me in. The soft, naive old woman who'd sigh, shake her head and say, "Let's not make this a big deal." No, that role had never quite fit me anyway, and now that she'd taken things so far, I wasn't about to let her walk away with my money, my dignity, or the lies she built around what it meant to call someone Mom. She may have thought I was old and too tired to fight, but I'd spent a lifetime watching numbers, tracing patterns, catching inconsistencies before they ever turned into problems. It's what made me good at my job, and it's what was about to make me very dangerous to the woman who thought she could outsmart me in my own home. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was upset or scared, but because I was awake with clarity. I sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 a.m, the lamp humming beside me as I went through my files. I found the documents tied to that credit card, dusty and folded behind older records I hadn't touched in years. Everything was still there. The enrollment confirmation for the monitoring program, the signatures, the correspondence from the Federal Review Department that had thanked Bill for voluntarily, including our household in their financial elder protection system, after he'd read about it in a news article. At the time, it seemed like something we'd never need. Now it felt like a gift from the man I still missed every single day. The next morning, I didn't call the bank again. I didn't even bother responding to Vanessa's message. Instead, I drove down to the branch I used to work at. Not the closest one, but the one where my old manager still worked and remembered me well. I walked in with my folder, asked for a printout of the full transaction history on the dormant card, and requested that it include all merchant details, timestamps, and geolocation data. They were happy to help. I thanked them with a smile and tucked everything back into my file before heading home. I sat with that paperwork for hours. I read every line, every entry. Jewelry store on Biscayne Boulevard, hotel suite with ocean view, spa package labeled Luxe Escape for 2, car rental, flight upgrades, all of it lined up with the dates I remembered. The same weekend Greg had mentioned Vanessa would be visiting a friend from college for a little break. I knew then that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment mistake or a lapse in judgment. This had been planned. She had walked into my home with a mission, searched for something valuable, and waited until my back was turned to make her move. And the worst part wasn't the theft itself. It was the smug satisfaction I saw in that photo, the way she looked as if she believed she'd won. I thought about confronting her right away. I imagined myself driving to their house and walking in with the folder, watching her expression as I laid it all out in front of her. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized she didn't deserve that. She didn't deserve the decency of a warning or the courtesy of a conversation. What she deserved was to face the full weight of her choices, and for once in her life, not be able to twist her way out of it. That's when I decided to call the fraud division directly. I spoke to a woman named Carla, soft-voiced but sharp, who listened patiently as I explained the situation. I told her about the dormant card, the monitoring tag still active on it, the recent unauthorized purchases, and the suspect I had in mind. Carla didn't rush me. She took detailed notes, asked precise questions, and by the end of the call, assured me that the case had been opened and flagged for high priority review due to the nature of the account and the documented consent from years back. She even said something I hadn't expected, that I had done the right thing by not canceling the card or alerting the suspect, as the system was now actively tracing activity in real time. When I hung up, I felt a stillness settle in my chest, not from fear or anger, but from control. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't reacting to something. I was setting the pace. I wasn't hoping someone else would handle it for me. I was choosing each step, and I knew where it would lead. 2 days later, I received another update from the fraud division. The card had been used again, not for purchases this time, but for a refund request. Vanessa had apparently tried to return one of the bracelets for store credit. She had shown identification, a temporary license with her photo, but my name. I could only imagine how she'd pulled it off, what story she must have spun, what details she'd rehearsed to sell the lie. It was clear now that this wasn't just opportunism. It was fraud, layered and deliberate, the kind that made people believe they were entitled to whatever they could get their hands on as long as they smiled while doing it. Greg, meanwhile, had no idea. He called that evening to check in, saying Vanessa was feeling tired from travel and might not be able to come by for dinner that weekend. He sounded distant, distracted. I could tell he had no clue what she was doing behind his back, and part of me wanted to protect him from the truth. But the rest of me, the part that had finally woken up, knew that protecting him also meant showing him exactly who he married. So I told him I completely understood, that maybe we could do dinner the following week. I made sure my voice stayed even, warm, unbothered. Because if Vanessa was going to think I was too soft to fight back, then I wanted her to stay comfortable, just long enough to feel the floor vanish beneath her feet. I had already begun preparing for the next step, and the moment would come soon. The one where I would look her in the eyes and serve her something far colder than the meal she expected. I spent the rest of that week in a state of quiet, deliberate motion. Each day felt like I was setting another piece on the board, careful not to tip my hand too early. I continued on as if nothing had happened. I answered calls with the same steady tone, watered my plants on schedule, smiled at the neighbors, and even picked up fresh flowers from the market to set on the table. Everything about my house looked warm, calm, inviting. But beneath the surface, I was sharper than I'd felt in years. I was no longer walking through life waiting for things to happen. I was preparing for a reckoning, and I wanted it to unfold in my home, on my terms, with every detail exactly as I planned. When I called Greg and said I'd love to have them over for Sunday dinner, he didn't suspect a thing. His voice sounded relieved, almost as if he believed whatever tension had settled between us lately might finally lift. He told me they were both looking forward to it and that Vanessa was doing better, though he didn't go into detail. I didn't press. I told him I'd make her favorite dish, the one she always bragged about to her friends, even though she'd once called it old-fashioned comfort food, with a smirk when she thought I wasn't listening. That meal had been passed down from my mother and her mother before her. It was something I usually made with care and sentiment. This time, I prepared it like a ritual. On Sunday afternoon, the weather turned unexpectedly pleasant. The light outside was soft, the breeze gentle through the screen door. I set the table with my best linens, the ivory ones with the embroidered edges, and polished the silver until it gleamed like something out of another decade. I poured sweet tea into the crystal glasses I hadn't used since Greg's engagement party. The kitchen smelled like warmth and home. It was a perfect setting for a family evening, or at least the illusion of one. When they arrived, I greeted them with a smile that reached my eyes just enough to keep things comfortable. Vanessa stepped into my kitchen like she belonged there, her heels clicking too loudly on the tile, her laugh just a little too bright as she complimented the smell and said how lucky Greg was to have a mother who still cooked. She looked around the room like she was scanning it for new things to take, but I gave her nothing to grab hold of. Greg seemed tired, worn down in that way I'd seen in men who were constantly trying to balance someone else's demands with their own fading instincts. We sat, we ate, we talked. I asked them about their week, and they told me about some vague work project Greg had been involved in and how Vanessa had spent a few days taking care of herself, which I imagined meant spa visits funded by someone else's money. She spoke casually about how some people simply didn't understand the importance of treating yourself, how life was too short to be stingy with comfort, and how she believed in manifesting abundance. She said all of it with the ease of someone who'd never truly earned anything in her life, but still believed she deserved everything. As the meal went on, she mentioned their recent hotel stay in passing, saying it had been just what she needed, and hinted that some people were generous in ways others could never understand. She smiled as she said it, then glanced at me as if expecting me to glow with approval. I nodded slowly, my hands folded on the table, and said I was glad she'd found time to enjoy herself. I kept my voice soft, my tone light, as if we were just three people sitting at a Sunday table with nothing beneath the surface. But I felt the weight of the folder in the drawer behind me, the one with receipts, printed photos, timelines, and every detail of what she thought she'd gotten away with. I didn't bring it out that night. I didn't say a word about the card or the bill or the fraud report with her name all over it. I let her talk. I let her spin her little story, smiling like she was the star of her own performance. And I listened like a woman who was too simple to see through it all, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing, just for a little while, and let someone show you who they really are when they think there won't be consequences. After dessert, they thanked me for the evening and made their way to the door. Greg kissed me on the cheek and said we should do this more often. Vanessa paused at the threshold, looked around the room with an expression that mixed amusement and ownership, and made a passing comment about how cozy everything felt, how it reminded her of the kind of homes people leave behind when they grow into bigger lives. I smiled and wished them a safe drive. The door closed. The lock clicked, and I stood in the quiet, letting the emptiness settle back around me like a calm after the storm. But this storm hadn't passed yet. It had only just begun. And the next time we'd see each other, the setting would be very different. Because that same evening, after the plates were washed and the house had returned to stillness, I took the folder out of the drawer and placed it neatly into a large envelope. I added the printed screenshots, the bank's confirmation letters, the internal tracking codes, and the copy of the statement showing the latest transaction she'd tried to refund under my name. I sealed it, wrote down the name of the investigator Carla had given me, and placed it by the door to mail first thing in the morning. The dinner had gone exactly as I needed it to, and soon the story she'd been telling herself, the one where I was the fool, would come to a sudden, bitter end. The morning after that dinner felt unusually quiet, even for my peaceful little house. I moved through the kitchen slowly, cleaning up the last of the dishes from the night before, still feeling the echo of Vanessa's voice in my ears, that syrupy tone she used when she thought she was in control of the conversation, when she imagined I was sitting there oblivious to what she'd done, smiling because I was too old or too kind to notice. But that calm on the surface was only skin deep now because I knew something she didn't. And the difference was, this time, I was the one pulling the strings. I mailed the envelope early, just as the post office doors opened, and I walked out into the sunlight feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The investigation was no longer just mine. It had hands now, official ones, and they were already moving faster than she could imagine. All I had to do was stay still and let the truth reach her like a wave that couldn't be outrun. But I didn't expect what happened next, and I certainly didn't expect it to happen so soon. That same afternoon, just as I was folding laundry in the back room, I heard a knock on the door. Not sharp or urgent, but firm, deliberate. For a split second, my heart jumped. I hadn't expected anyone. I wiped my hands and walked to the door, opened it, and there she stood, Vanessa, with her arms full of fresh flowers and that same rehearsed smile stretched across her face like a mask that was starting to crack at the edges. She said she was in the neighborhood and had wanted to stop by to thank me again for dinner, that she'd picked up some flowers on the way, said they made her think of me. Soft, familiar, old-fashioned. Her tone was playful, but behind her eyes I saw something twitch. It was the way she kept glancing around the living room, her eyes darting just slightly too fast, as if she was looking for something, or making sure something was still hidden. I invited her in with a nod, holding the door just long enough to make her hesitate before stepping inside. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd once taken my purse when I wasn't looking, and I poured us tea, steady as ever. She chatted about the hotel spa and how she'd finally learned to relax, and how the world just seemed more generous lately, like things were finally going her way. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet bag, saying she'd brought me a little token of thanks, something simple but meaningful. And as she placed it on the table in front of me, I felt a flicker of alarm crawl up my spine, because inside that bag was a bracelet. Not new, not from a store. It was mine. One I hadn't worn in years, one that had been kept in a small jewelry box in the guest bedroom closet, hidden behind a stack of old linens I hadn't touched since Bill passed. She said she'd found it while tidying up after dinner, claimed she'd spotted it under a side table and thought maybe I had misplaced it. Her voice was light, almost amused, but her eyes were watching me too closely. For a moment I thought this was it, that she knew, that somehow she'd found the envelope before I mailed it, or had gotten wind of the investigation. I felt my pulse in my ears, loud and fast, but I kept my expression neutral. I took the bracelet in my hand, turned it slowly, and thanked her as if nothing about the situation felt wrong. I told her how thoughtful she was, how nice it was to see her again so soon, and I offered her another cup of tea. But I was watching her too, and I saw it. The hesitation in her breath, the slight tension in her fingers as she held the cup, the way she didn't drink it right away, like she was calculating something in real time. She stayed just long enough to make me wonder whether she had come to gloat or to check how close I was to the truth. And just as she stood up to leave, she paused near the window, looked at me, and said that sometimes it was the people closest to us who surprised us the most, then smiled and walked out without waiting for a response. The door closed behind her, and I stood frozen for a moment, still holding the bracelet, wondering whether she had sensed what was coming. I felt like I'd been walking a tightrope, and just for a second the wind had shifted, just enough to make me wobble. But I hadn't fallen. Not yet. And the look on her face, that subtle flicker of something she hadn't meant to show, told me I still had the upper hand. 3 days later, it happened. Greg called, his voice clipped and tense, asking if I was home. He said someone needed to speak with me. And within the hour, 2 uniformed officers pulled into my driveway in a dark sedan with government plates. They didn't come to question me. They came to update me and to collect additional documentation. The case had escalated. Evidence was now being reviewed by a financial crimes task force, and they were ready to move forward. Meanwhile, Vanessa had no idea. She was still walking around like nothing was wrong, still acting as though the world owed her something simply because she'd reached for it. But the knock that came for me that afternoon would soon echo at her own door. And when it did, there wouldn't be tea waiting on the other side. The day of the hearing came faster than I expected, and yet not fast enough. I'd spent weeks preparing, gathering statements, collecting paperwork, reviewing dates and transactions, until the numbers played through my dreams like ticking clocks. Carla from the fraud division had been patient and thorough, walking me through every step, assuring me the evidence was solid, airtight, impossible to twist. And still, a part of me remained on edge. Not because I doubted the facts, but because I knew how people like Vanessa operated. She didn't fight fair. She didn't confess. She performed. And she had a way of bending sympathy like light through water, always making herself the victim in any room she entered. The courthouse smelled like paper and varnish, cold and too bright, with hard floors and harder benches. I sat quietly while Greg entered with Vanessa beside him, dressed in pale beige with her hair pulled back in a simple braid, her makeup soft and her expression innocent. She looked like someone who volunteered at a garden club, not someone being accused of financial misconduct and identity fraud. Greg barely glanced at me as they passed, and that small gesture, that quiet absence of connection, hurt more than I was ready for. When they called the case, the attorneys began laying out the timeline, presenting exhibits, statements, surveillance footage, screenshots, even the automated flags from the banking system. I expected Vanessa to shift uncomfortably, to crack under pressure, but instead she sat still, nodding at the right moments, even smiling gently, as if the entire event was a misunderstanding she was generously willing to clear up. And then, just when I thought we'd reached the turning point, her lawyer stood up and did something I never expected. He painted me as unstable. He spoke gently, almost regretfully, about my age, about recent memory gaps, about the possibility that I had misunderstood my own finances. He said perhaps I had offered the card to Vanessa in a moment of generosity and had forgotten, or maybe I'd mistakenly believed the charges were unauthorized, when in fact I had approved them. I felt the room tilt slightly. I looked at Greg, and he wasn't looking back. He was staring down at the table, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. For a moment, it felt like I'd been pushed off a cliff. Everything I had done, all the documentation, all the control, now felt like it was slipping out from under me. The judge asked if I had any final statement. I stood slowly, legs trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of all those months, all those mornings waking up alone, all the moments I doubted myself. And I spoke, not with fury, but with clarity. I didn't talk about the bracelet or the text messages. I talked about what it feels like to be taken for granted, about the erosion that happens when people look at you and see a weakness where there is only kindness, about how easily trust can be weaponized when you're quiet, and how easily love can be used against you when people mistake softness for stupidity. The courtroom was silent when I sat back down, but I knew words alone might not be enough, and just when I thought the gavel would fall in her favor, something happened. Carla entered the courtroom with a sealed envelope in her hand and handed it to the prosecution. Inside was a new piece of evidence, a recorded phone call Vanessa had made from the hotel spa, where she bragged to an old friend about using the old woman's forgotten card and laughing that it was probably still registered under some kind of government watch. She'd said it casually, like a joke, but the call had been picked up because the hotel's customer service lines were recorded. And now, that little slip of arrogance had become the knife that cut through every one of her carefully constructed lies. The courtroom shifted. Vanessa's smile finally cracked. Greg looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time in what felt like years, and I saw something leave his eyes, not rage, not betrayal, but a kind of mourning for a version of life he'd convinced himself he had. The judge's tone turned colder, his questions sharper, and the final ruling came with no room for interpretation. Vanessa was ordered to pay restitution in full, placed under supervised probation for financial misconduct, and barred from holding any financial authority over others for 5 years. But the biggest punishment wasn't written on paper. It was watching her walk out of that courtroom, knowing her little empire of manipulation had finally collapsed. Greg didn't speak to me that day. Not yet. He walked out alone, his face pale, his hands in his pockets like a boy who'd just watched his world burn down. I let him go. I didn't follow. Because sometimes silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's the first breath someone takes when they realize they've been breathing someone else's lies for too long. The weeks that followed the hearing passed slowly, like mist clearing after a storm. My days returned to a quieter rhythm, coffee in the mornings, walking to the mailbox, tending to my herbs in the backyard. But the silence was different now. It wasn't heavy anymore. It felt earned. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't walking through my own house with second guesses or self-doubt pressing on my shoulders. I had stood my ground, and the truth had spoken for itself. Still, a part of me kept waiting. Not for Vanessa. She had vanished like a storm that finally ran out of sky, but for Greg, my son, the one I had protected even as he drifted too far to reach. Then one Sunday morning, weeks after the ruling, I opened my front door and found a familiar car parked in the driveway. Greg stood at the bottom of the steps, not with flowers or apologies, but with a quiet look on his face that told me everything I needed to know. He didn't come to justify, explain, or fix anything. He simply said he hadn't known, not really, and that sometimes it takes watching someone fall apart to understand what you were holding on to. We talked for a long time, not about Vanessa, not about the trial, but about childhood things, about Bill, about who he was becoming now that the noise was gone. I thought that would be the end of it, a peaceful close, a quiet victory. But life, as I'd come to learn, rarely ends a story without testing whether you truly understand what you've survived. It happened 3 weeks later. A letter arrived, no return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper with only one sentence. You think it's over, but you owe me everything. There was no name, no threat, just that one line, enough to feel like a chill through an open window. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper in my hands, staring at the words, and for a flicker of a moment, doubt crept back in. Had I missed something? Had Vanessa found a way to come back, to twist the story again? But then I remembered. Fear only grows in the dark. So I did what I'd learned to do. I took the letter to the same investigator who had handled my case, and within days, they traced it back to a private mailbox rented under a fake name. Turns out, Vanessa had tried to open a business in another state using a variation of my name, Linda M. Brower instead of Linda May Brower, and was trying to apply for small business loans under that identity. It was desperate, sloppy, and riddled with mistakes. She'd gotten bolder, yes, but also careless. That was the final thread she pulled loose. Within 2 weeks, the authorities had reopened her case, not just for the loan fraud, but for violation of probation terms and identity misuse. I received a notice in the mail that she had been detained during a routine ID check, and this time the charges wouldn't end with a fine or community service. This time she wouldn't be able to twist herself out of it with soft voices and fake smiles. Greg called again after the news broke. He said little, but I could hear the weight in his voice. This time he didn't defend anyone. He only said that some people can't stop until they destroy everything around them, and that he was grateful I hadn't let her destroy me. Later that month, I attended a community gathering at the old library where I used to volunteer. One of the new organizers, a kind man named Harold, who had moved into town last year after retiring from teaching, stopped me at the refreshment table. We talked about books, about gardening, about how funny it is that people start second chapters when they least expect it. He asked if I'd like to join a book club he was starting, and I said yes. Not because I was looking for anything, but because I had finally made room for something new. That night, I sat on my porch as the sun slipped behind the trees, the breeze soft against my skin. I wore a simple gold band on my hand. Not a gift, not from Bill, not a trophy, but a reminder. I had bought it myself the week after the final hearing. Inside, I had it engraved with 3 words. I remember everything. Because sometimes they call you Mom with a smile as they take what's not theirs, and sometimes they send letters trying to scare you back into silence. But if you've ever stood alone with nothing left but your truth and your spine, then you know. You take back your name, your space, your power. And when they come for you again, they'll find someone who doesn't tremble anymore, And now, if you're still listening, maybe you've been there too. Maybe someone once thought you were weak because you gave too much. Maybe they took what wasn't theirs and smiled while doing it. So I want to ask you, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have smiled back and let the knock come for them?